Okay, everyone, thanks for joining me tonight. My name's Dr. Bauth. I'm one of the staff doctors here at Georgia Chiropractic Neurology Center. And before we begin, I would like to invite everyone watching to go back onto YouTube and go into my first talk on anxiety and what we do here. I think it'll give you a really, really good ground basis for the things I'm about to share with you tonight. And what I'm about to share with you tonight is based on some of the questions that I've received from our first presentation. And so the bulk of the questions have come from, hey, how does this thing called sensory mismatch work, and how do I apply it to me? And can you give me more examples of how that goes? And so hopefully tonight we'll have a little better idea. The reason we're doing it, and one of the most important things to remember through this talk, is sensory mismatches have a high probability of creating anxious states in people. And so anxiety is a massive problem now in 2025. 1 in 5 people in America suffers with anxiety, some of them very severe, some of them debilitating, and others not as much. They can go through their day, but it still takes away from the joys that they're able to experience. And so when we think about anxiety, we want to remember that we always want to work on the cause. And one of the things that we try to address here is what's causing the problem that people are having. Now, when we think about anxiety, we can think about a variety of symptoms that it causes, everything from headaches to libido functions, to immune functions, to digestive issues, blood pressure problems, insomnia. So the list goes on. And, it really can take away from the experiences of life and just being able to enjoy your day-to-day. So with sensory mismatch, what we want to think about is what are the functions of the brain in a simplified version. So the brain receives information all the time from our body, and then our body has this ability to send information out to meet its demands. So that's called a sensory nervous system and a motor nervous system. Our sensory nervous system is broken down into parts that mostly everyone is familiar with, our special senses, what we smell, what we taste, what we hear, things that we see. And then our brain gets those messages and it interprets it, and it has to send a right response out to meet the demands at any given time. So if you can imagine, like, I'm thirsty, therefore I'm going to drink. Some of the information that comes in from the sensory nervous system we call conscious. In other words, you're aware of it. Other information that comes in from our sensory nervous system is called unconscious. We're not aware of it. And so most people have had the experience of having something occur to their day-to-day and then they act on it. But when you break it down quite simply, life is no more complicated than sensory information into our brain and motor information out. And if we look at our brain here, our brain's constantly receiving information from our various parts. And I've lifted some of those out for us here. Our viscera, our internal organs, our heart, our lungs, our digestive system, bowel, bladder, from our skin, from our joints, from our muscles, from our vestibular system, which is a real fun system. It's not only what we hear, but it's our inner ear that helps us know where we are in time and space and make appropriate movements based on that, as well as how our body is ambulated and positioned within time and space. Our eyes, our ears, and the list goes on. So there are what we call 3 big pathways into the brain. And that's what comes from our soma, or our body, what comes from our eyes, and what comes in through the ears. Again, not just what we hear, but our balance centers as well. And all of that information has to match, and it has to join up at certain parts of the brain. And then that information is fed forward into our frontal lobes, so we know what's going on, and then we make an appropriate response to it. And as I mentioned, sometimes what can occur is these things we call sensory mismatches. And if you've seen Dr. Ellis talk, he talked a lot about this. And one of the great examples he gives, and I use all the time myself, is this idea of, like, sometimes you're sitting in a car and you're not moving, but the car next to you will start to slowly move forward, and it feels just for a second as if you're moving backward. That's sensory mismatch. And we can have those on during various times of the day, and they're normal. We should be able to go, oh, okay, that wasn't really happening that right now. But other times, depending on things that get injured, certain things that we experience, we can lose appropriate matching in our brains and then start to experience things that aren't real. And so if we think about what is real, we want to talk about the word perception. So perception is an awareness of our environment through sensation, right? And so we talked about it, right? I'm hungry, therefore I eat. Some things we don't feel, like gravity. Gravity pushes down on us constantly, and it's constantly stimulating these little areas of our body called muscle spindles. And those muscle spindles will fire, and they will send information to the brain that actually activates our brain. And it's a fundamental stimulus, meaning that without that activation of our brain, a lot of our other systems don't actually even work or work as well. So we want to have correct perception to our sensory input. Does that make sense? Okay. So what we want to do is clear up any mismatches that occur. So going back to the micro, this is true from our bodily states, from the state of the organism, to our cells that make us up. Remember, the human being is an organism made of anywhere from 50 to 60 to 70 trillion cells. And each cell has its own intelligence, if you will, in that we can take that cell and study its behavior. And we find that if we take the cell and we put it into a petri dish to study what it's doing, if we put some food in there for that cell, the cell will move towards that food or into what we call growth. And if we put a toxin or something poisonous to that cell, the cell will move away from that toxin into protection, right? And so it would be decidedly inconvenient for 50 trillion cells to be doing all their own little thing in there. So all cells surrender that individual response to a central voice. And in the human body, that central voice is our central nervous system or our brain. And so when we experience something as an organism, we have a general tendency to either move towards or away from it, right? And another way that we can look at this in our human experience is either love or fear or growth or protection. And so if you can imagine, as we're going throughout life, we have these experiences that we find enjoyable and we move toward them. We have these experiences that we have not enjoyable and we try to move away from them. But part of being an adult, part of living in this world is having to deal with the rigors of day-to-day stress and being able to function. So one of the things that the brain does is it has this mechanism, and the fancy words for it are hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis. And the HPA axis is kind of like our alarm system. It tells us what's going on so our brains can respond to it. And the hypothalamus is a portion of our brain, and what it does is it receives information from the environment, good or bad, and it sends a hormone out to our pituitary gland. And our pituitary gland is our master hormone gland. It manufactures all of the different hormones for day-to-day metabolism. And then a pituitary gland will get that information from the hypothalamus and send a signal to your adrenal glands. And that adrenal response is called our stress response. It's a release of cortisol, and it puts us into gear. And for a standpoint of growth versus protection, it will either say, hey, this is something that is good for me or something that I got to move away from. However, a sensory mismatch can occur because we understand that even though we're driving or interacting in our day-to-day life, we can't necessarily repel or go away from a stimulus. That would be bad for us. And so, one of the things that happens is nowadays we live in an on-set society or a get-set society. And even though our brains want to put us into growth and say, hey, I'm going to just stay in, We have to go to work. We have to deal with our mortgages and our marriages and our bills and etc. And so what winds up happening is a little bit of a confusion, and that's another example of a sensory mismatch. So your brain is telling you to go or to put up your dukes and fight, but your eyes and your ears and your body is experiencing, well, I'm just sitting here on the couch. I don't know why I should go right now. And then that can create states of unease in the body. And then that unease can reach to a point of where it starts to cause things like anxiety. So when we're in a growth phase, our inner body, our viscera, it overrides our outer body or our somatic system. So the two systems work hand in hand. If we're in growth, our system is relaxed. And when we're relaxed, we refer to that as a rest and digest. That's when everything's working at ease. And our body is kind of saying, hey, we don't have to worry about protection right now. But when we have to go into fight or flight, then our somatic system engages and it shuts down growth. Does that make good sense to everybody? The conscious mind, what you and I are sitting here engaged in right now, it's an amazing thing. But when compared to the subconscious mind, there's a huge lopsidedness. The conscious mind can only deal with about 2,000 bits of information per second. The subconscious mind deals with 4 billion bits of information per second. And if everyone's looking at the screen right now, or just imagining their TV or whatever they're looking at, I want you to think of the bits of information as a pixel. And most people look at a computer screen or a TV, and they understand that the more pixels they are, the finer the picture there is. So if we're looking at our screen, a small dot of that screen would be a comparison of conscious to the rest of the screen, which would be subconscious. So during our day, most of us aren't thinking about our bodies or what we're doing. We get in our car, and if we've driven it before, you get it and you get where you're going and you go, how did I even get here, right? Most of us have had that experience of, unless it's the first time you've driven or just learning how to drive, your system has downloaded a program. Well, guess what? Life is a series of programs that we're always engaged in. And so what can happen is we learn patterns of how to deal with things. We learn them because of our social constructs, right? We learn what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad. And those things become very habitual to us, and we just act in accordance to them. However, when something challenges that, it can give us pause and say, hey, what's going on right now? So there's an ability that the brain has for you to filter out most of the things that we deal with from a day-to-day stress. But as I said, this habitual pattern that the subconscious mind has, it's based on programming. So when we're very, very young, our conscious minds aren't very, our brains aren't very conscious. They're just in this repetition learning phase for the first several years. And that's why conscious parenting is so important. And we get to an age of reason. And the age of reason is right around age 6 or 7. And right around the age of 6 or 7, the brain starts working on a different wavelength, and then we start becoming an active participant with our reality and making choices. What most of us don't realize, however, at that point is that the choices we make a lot of times are dependent upon the program that we've received. And so every day someone will say something to me like, hey, ever since XYZ happened, I just haven't been the same, right? Maybe it was a physical trauma, maybe it was a concussion, maybe it was a loss of a loved one. And what we have to do is we have to go into the system and find out where their system has become disjointed, where their system has become changed to such a degree where their conscious mind and their subconscious mind are not in agreement and not in accord. And that's some of the stuff that I do here at the clinic. Now, how it can happen? It can happen because of, again, toxicity. It can happen because of emotional stressors. It can happen because of accidents. And so you can't go back in time and undo the traumas in our life, but what we can do is we can start to adapt better to those stressors. Fair? So we always want to be conscious of when they can start, when these programs can become laid down. And realistically, they can start intra-utero. If you go back and look online and look at my first talk, I show this great little video of an argument taking place with a fetus in utero. And you could see the unborn child responding to a stimulus. And it's really, really powerful. And what most of us don't realize is that we are responsible for the generation that's coming behind us. And so conscious parenting is extraordinarily important. But that only can take you so far, because if you're an adult, if you're not married, if you're not having kids, then you're left to your day-to-day. And it's like, are you in your reactive brain? Are you doing things based on what you have become to think is the right thing? Or are you doing things because you're consciously aware of what you're doing and you're making changes and making decisions based on that? So those are some of the things that we help here at the clinic. Okay? And so this is a fascinating article I came across about conscious parenting, and it looks at the brains of mice that were nurtured versus the brains of mice that were stressed. And what they found is that the offspring of the mice that were stressed constantly were built for battle. They were built with a smaller forebrain and larger body mass. In other words, not really thinkers, but fighters. Contrast to the parents that were nurtured, they have a larger forebrain and smaller body mass. They were born to intellectualize and think their problems through. And so this is fascinating. We don't have any of these types of studies for human beings, but taking this and extrapolating out, we can see where it's very, very important to be conscious of what we think about. And so, perception, the awareness of environment through sensation, a lot of it is based on what we see. And it's like, do we see that bee and go, be afraid, that bee can sting me and harm me? Should I run? Or do we say, hey, that's a source of honey, and that's part of nature, and that's a pollinator, and that pollinator is going to spread pollen so that we have more beauty and more flowers. And if we take that single concept and we apply it to our day-to-day, do we tend to first look at our strangers as enemies, or do we tend to look at them as potential friends, potential allies? And so we see the far-reaching ramifications of this from a day-to-day standpoint, but we can break it down to, just the family unit, right? Is it a naughty child, or is it a child that's just seeking attention? All right. Is my spouse or my friend doing this to get a rise out of me, or is it a call for love? And so I think it's always important to remember that perception is our basis for life. And sometimes that perception can get skewed. Why? Because of traumas. We've got case after case after case of people who come in, and either the spouse or the parent or the sibling will say, they're just not the same anymore. I want my husband back. I want my spouse back. I want my child back. I had a happy-go-lucky kid. He had suffered a concussion. Next thing you know, he's suicidal. And so instead of treating the effects and trying to label that suicide and treating the child as if that is the problem, we try to look back more to the cause, which is the nervous system, and see if we can find out where things got turned off, if you will, and turn them back on and lead to more appropriate function. And this is what our profession has been doing for probably the past 120 years. But even back in the early 1900s, there was a place called Clearview Sanitarium, which took care of a lot of medically indigent people with mood-based disorders. So I'm proud to say that I'm continuing the tradition that's been held in our profession for a very, very long time. Dee Palmer said that when a member of society has fallen, please choose an educator first to enlighten and remove the stumbling blocks so they may not fall again. And so if anyone has any questions, I would welcome them to call our office for a free consultation. Come by, visit us, 770-664-4288, and I am here for you in any way that I can be. Thank you for joining us tonight.